problem with the memory, but we're back again. So I was saying that we come from these different periods of literature in which they presented some sort of solutions, either logical or emotional with romanticism, or scientific with neoclassical, well, a lot of different things that were supposed to give us the answer to our problems. And all this knowledge, all this self-contemplation, all this ambition only took us to the Wars of Us, right? That is the World War One and Two. So basically, people were completely disenchanted, specifically artists and specifically young people, and they decided that the values that have been, let's say, the rule by the time were completely useless. That we required some sort of a complete overturn, a complete change in the moral values, in the artistic values, in the way in which we express ourselves in literature, in a lot of different fronts of artistic expressions. Um, so first of all, we would have to say that this was highly influenced by philosophy. So we are going to see that modernists, in their literary regulations or rules or structures, and painters or sculptors in the way that they painted, the way they carved rock, uh, all their artistic manifestations were highly influenced by philosophy. So we have, for example, a lot of influence in terms of the negation of will by Schopenhauer. Um, Basically, like how are we sometimes slaves of our nature, and we act in an not an apparently logical way, even though we are educated, even though we have had different family upbringing. So some things related to that. Nietzsche, of course, too, um, with his Antichrist, with his Superman, and let's say the necessity that he proposed from going completely away from religious beliefs, and sort of taking charge as human beings of our own future. This may ring a bell, or sound a little bit similar to what they propose in Renaissance. Nevertheless, in here is a complete overturn um, on the perspective of doing this. And if you have a, let's say, a general idea of what Nietzsche says in all these different books, you will see that it's in consonance to the different values of the modern period. And well, we have some other philosophers that influence in this way. Now, as I was saying, the idea is that we are going to completely refund um, the values, the moral values, the artistic values, and if the moral, the values, the ethics were not able to give us a bright future, or not able to give us a better outcome than the war, uh, well, it's art in here, the one who's supposed to express all these different things. So that's why we start like seeing a lot of different proposals that start, let's say, in a subtle way to try to subvert the values of the different artistic manifestations. So let's say that painters start getting away from realism and reproduction of trying to imitate life the way it is, and try to represent it in different ways, to make it a little bit more figurative, try to go away from what we see every day to try to express different things. um, so that's why we see like certain uh, or different aesthetics in terms of the representation of the human body, in the use of colors, in the use of different things in there in order to transmit different ideas. Um, let's say that these people didn't have a clear north. They didn't know exactly where they were going, but what they did know, sorry, is that well, they needed to move into a complete different um, direction. So we can call this um, different artistic manifestation subversive. What does it mean subversive? What does it mean to subvert? Well, it's really simple to take something that was uh, being done in a certain way in the past and twist it, right? Like change it completely, do the opposite of what they were doing in the past, but in a very drastic way. So if you can see the previous periods that we have managed so far, they were somehow opposed. Every new period was opposed to the previous one, but in this or starting the modern period, I would say that it's the more drastic um, transformation in terms of this. And as they didn't know what they were going, so you can see the emotions in their manifestation, and you can see the confusion, and nobody really knew like where they were going or what they wanted. They just wanted to run away from the establishment. So we see that in all the different uh, works of art in here, or specifically in literature, right? As you can see over here in the presentation, it says that the form and the content, right? The way in which it is presented and the way that, let's say, the idea that contains itself, it reflects confusion and reflects chaos, right? And reflects sort of the vicissitudes that they were having at the moment. So you would say that one word to describe these different ways of representing things, it's messy, right? You don't really understand all the time what is trying to be said, and this is a very important characteristic that we have in here, that says that the expositions and resolutions are omitted. Like um, I am not trying to convince anybody that my way is the way that it's supposed to be. I am not even sure myself of what I'm doing with this literature piece, with this poem, with this tale, with this novel. But I'm just trying to explore a new way of doing things that were a failure in the past. Um, so basically, that's what we see. And here, more than in any other previous period, the themes are implied rather than stated. Uh, there is virtually non-existent modern um, works that are evident, yes, that are literal. They are always trying to present us with something figurative, with let's say some sort of a riddle, some sort of a password to crack, right? So it requires a lot of cooperation of the reader, because if you read many of these works of art and of literature, and try to interpret them in a, let's say, a literal way, well, they are going to mean nothing. Yes, it's going to be quite difficult to get them. So let's say that those are the most important aspects of the modern period. Uh, the experimentation with form, with content, the idea of being completely opposed to everything that happened in the past, and the fact of trying to refound, to relearn, or to establish new values or new codes for creativity, and well, a period that was highly confusing at the beginning, but of course, once you get the hang of it, you try to find in an easier way all these hidden meanings or agendas that they were having. Let's finish this part with the slide number 115, in which we find some of the most important authors in here. I would like to refer to just a couple. For example, James Joyce is one of the most important representatives of modern literature. Again, this is debatable because some people include it into the postmodern, and it's a fuzzy limit in there, a discussion that I'm not going to get into right now. But let's say that the most important of him is, for example, the experimentation with the flow of consciousness. I think I have talked about this in maybe a previous class, and it's almost like automatic writing. You write whatever comes to your mind at the moment without any sort of filter. So try to exemplify that right now, and try to put it into a piece of paper, right? So let's say that if I ask you to write a summary about the video or an opinion under the regular conditions, you would try to look for, some things to make me feel that this is important and relevant, and you would say, well, yes, also Diego was talking about certain things that were relevant for the literary periods. Nevertheless, you will filter out certain thoughts or private thoughts like, well, this is really boring, I don't care about this is not going to be worthy or useful at all for my professional practice. Well, a lot of different things that you can say, right? Like, it's Friday, I don't want to be listening to this right now. Well, that is the flow of consciousness, like to write every single thing that happened and that comes to your mind at the moment. That's why it's so messy, right? So, because you may be thinking about certain transcendental and important, and at that very moment, a fly crosses your path, and then you get distracted and you write about that. Um, Again, think about your interior voice, your inner voice. Like, does it have a gender? Is it always talking at the same speed? Does it use formal vocabulary or is it informal? Does it curse? Does it swear? Well, a lot of these different things. And let's say that one really important example of that is James Joyce and his Ulysses. That it's basically, uh, let's say, the story of uh, a day in the life of a man, right? So it's about 24 hours, maybe a little bit more. There's a certain discussion, and the book is about, I don't know, I don't remember right now, 600 to 700 pages. You would say that that may be like a little too much to describe that. But remember what I'm telling you right now, that it's that he wrote almost every single thing that he thought about. And of course, it's confusing to read this book at the beginning because you don't know who's talking, you don't know if it's himself or it switch characters, if this is happening in the present, or it's a memory, or it's a desire or an imagination, or let's say an imaginary situation that he recreated for the future. um, and he never explains that, right? You have to infer it, and that's exactly the way your brain works, right? Like, you don't tell yourself when you're thinking about something, when you're daydreaming, you don't need to tell yourself that you are. You just describe it or picture it in your brain. So that's why this sort of literature is so complicated. Um, about Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway, well, that was another one of the modern important authors, and even though his literature is much more digestible, let's say that it's much more linear, he went into um, really interesting places. For example, the possibility of telling stories about the war, telling stories that are sort of autobiographical, right? You would see many characters that are himself, just using different names, about the futility of love, about the possibility in most of his books that love wouldn't triumph. Um, Talking about sexuality, talking about let's say sex as an instrumental thing that it's not necessarily connected to love, and talk it in an open way, say it in an open way, talking about fears, talking about a lot of different things that make human being look vulnerable. So that's what we can say about Hemingway. And well, we have a lot of different authors in here. For example, D.H. Lawrence, that was very sexually explicit, um, and that even started including a very graphic description of homosexual relationships, which was taboo even then. Um, Virginia Woolf, of course, that was really, really important because, as you may remember, she eventually committed suicide, and she's one of these writers that by the end of her life found everything so uh, futile, so useless, that she just decided to kill herself. And it's a really important female figure in literature. And again, her production discusses and deals with all these, let's say, change of paradigms about the role of women in society, and why does she required to be in the kitchen? Why does she need to be uh, exclusively useful for reproduction, all these different things. So even then, you see, like we started from Anglo-Saxon, in which uh, women were completely worthless, until the modern era that it's relatively close to our time, and even then, women were still struggling because of their rights. So we have this in terms of modern period. Just think about those general perspectives. And briefly, I will be coming with the postmodern video, which I'm sure it will be much shorter than this one because there's certain things that are, let's say, repeated in terms of the essential things. We will see in a second.